Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bernard Schwartz, the director of the Unterberg Poetry Center, and it's my privilege to welcome you to tonight's readings by Paul Auster and Javier Marías. Mr. Auster will be introduced by Rick Moody, and Mr. Marías by Wyatt Mason. On behalf of the Poetry Center, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank some of our seasoned supporters: the Greenwood family, the National Endowment for the Arts, Eva Usdan, Joan and Jack Jacobson, the Kaplan Foundation, Amazon, and the New York State Council on the Arts. Following tonight's readings, both writers have kindly agreed to answer questions from the audience. You should have received an index card in your printed program. If you have a question, please write it down and pass it to one of the ushers. After this brief Q&A, we invite you to join us all for a reception and book signing in the art gallery next door. Books will be available for purchase at that time, courtesy of Barnes & Noble. The next event in our main reading series will take place on Monday, December 7th, when Tony Award-winning actor Stephen Dillane will read from the poetry of Samuel Beckett. Mr. Dillane is the star of Lincoln Center's upcoming production of One Evening, a theater piece featuring Beckett's writing and Schubert's Winterreise. For more on the influence of music on Beckett's work, you might check out the Sunday's Brunch Time lecture by Martha Fossenfeld and Lois Overbeck, the two editors who have spent the last 25 years preparing an edition of Beckett's letters. Tickets to these upcoming events can be purchased via our website, 92y.org/poetry. Wyatt Mason is a contributing editor at Harper's, where his articles earned him a National Magazine Award in 2006. He has written on Javier Marías and other subjects for The New Yorker and the New York Times Book Review, and has also been published in The New Republic, the London Review of Books, The Nation, Slate, and the New York Times Magazine. His translations of the works of Rimbaud are published by the Modern Library. In presenting him the 2005 Nona Balakian Citation for Excellence in Reviewing, the National Book Critics Circle praised his endless erudition and a singular, tireless focus on quality. Rick Moody's novels include The Ice Storm, which was made into a feature film by Ang Lee, Purple America, and The Diviners. His story collections are The Ring of Brightest Angels Around Heaven, Demonology, and Right Livelihoods. The Black Veil, his memoir, was honored with the PEN Martha Albrand Award. His new novel, The Four Fingers of Death, will be out in the summer of 2010. Please welcome Rick Moody as he introduces Paul Auster.
Hello, it's an honor to be here. I wrote all these really thoughtful remarks, but I'm going to try to deliver them like a human being instead of like someone reading an introduction, if possible. The gist of the remarks is very simple. Almost everyone here, I'm willing to believe, knows how great a novelist Paul Auster is. His reputation is totally deserved. I first encountered him when I read the New York trilogy. I think it was in the late 80s. I was completely blown away by it. Those novels have become a classic. I think the New York trilogy is a classic. The Invention of Solitude is a classic. The recent novels reflect on the classics very well. The Book of Illusions, I think, is easily as good as Paul's greatest work. We all know all this. So what can I possibly say about Paul that you guys don't already know to some degree? I scoured my heart, and I came up with two little morsels of information, and they're really just how other writers think about Paul, how we who labor in the trenches of American literature think about this amazing contemporary writer. The first point is not apparent probably to people who are just readers, but Paul is to many writers, many contemporary younger writers, an incredible good citizen. He's one of those older writers who will take time any day to go out to dinner with you and kind of give support to the incredibly difficult job of trying to get on with writing, and who shares in that setting his enthusiasm and his belief in what we're doing. And if I made a list of younger novelists working in Brooklyn right now, the best and brightest of that group would all be people who have been lucky enough to sit at the table with Paul and to have some of his reflected brilliance shower down upon them. I'm one of them, Jonathan Lethem, Nicole Krauss, Jonathan Safran Foer. It's a large group of writers who look up to Paul as an example of how to be a writer in the world. That's point number one. Point number two is that the singular spot that Paul seems to occupy, to me, in American letters, is this spot that kind of mixes together classic American literature of the Hawthorne, Poe, Melville, Dickinson, Emerson variety with a modernist strain that comes out of Europe. And when I think of those writers, I'm thinking of Beckett, perhaps Pinget, a little bit of Breton, and a whole strain of the European novel that's concerned with form as much as it's concerned with the mechanics of storytelling. We heard recently from the Nobel Committee that American literature is disengaged, not involved with the world. American literature, according to them, is the sow who eats her farrow, as Joyce said. And if that's true, how lucky are we to have a writer like Paul who is connected with this European tradition and marrying what's great about what we've done in this continent with what's happening over there in Europe at the same time. Both these things, the personal generosity and the way his work opens up possibilities, both of these things are about generosity, it seems to me, and about openness and vulnerability and largesse with respect to literature's role in the world. I find that invaluable. I find the work invaluable. I find the voice invaluable, that simple, gestural, passionate voice that's unadorned but has a lot going on beneath the surface. So I can't think of a contemporary writer that I admire as much. And I think the new book is totally great, and we're lucky to hear from it tonight. It's right up there with the best work he's done in the last 10 years. So please welcome Paul Auster.
I paid Rick a lot of money to say all that. All right, I'm going to read from Invisible, a recently published novel. I'm going to start on page 106. So just to give you a little background about what's been going up to this point, our narrator is a young 20-year-old student. The year is 1967. The place is New York City. It's the summer of '67. He's a Columbia student. His sister, who's about a year and a half older than he is, has graduated from college and is going to be going to graduate school at Columbia in the fall, and they are sharing an apartment that summer. Adam Walker has had a very rough spring. In part one, all kinds of terrible things have happened to him. He's in very bad shape. And here we are in July of 1967. It is early July, and you and your sister have been living together for 2 weeks now. Since all your friends have vanished for the summer, Gwyn is the only person you have seen, not counting the people you work with at the library, but they don't count for much. You have no girlfriend at the moment, and your sister has recently parted ways with a young professor she was involved with for the past year and a half. Therefore, you have only each other for company. But there is nothing wrong with that as far as you are concerned, and all in all, you are more than satisfied with the way things have worked out since she moved in with you. You are entirely at ease in her company. You can talk more openly with her than anyone else you know, and your relations are remarkably free of conflict. Every now and then she becomes annoyed with you for neglecting to wash the dishes or leaving a mess in the bathroom. But each time you fall down on the domestic front, you promise to mend your lackadaisical ways, and little by little you have been improving. It is a happy arrangement then, just as you imagined it would be when you proposed the idea in the first place. And now that you are slowly going to pieces at your job in the Castle of Yawns, which is Butler Library at Columbia, in the Castle of Yawns, you understand that living in the apartment with your sister is no doubt helping you keep your sanity, that more than anyone else, she has the power to lighten the despair you carry around inside you. On the other hand, the fact that you are together again has produced some curious effects, consequences you did not foresee when the two of you discussed the possibility of joining forces back in the spring. Now you ask yourself how you could have been so blind. You and Gwyn are brother and sister. You belong to the same family, and therefore it is only natural during the course of the long conversations you have with each other that family matters should sometimes be mentioned. Remarks about your parents, references to the past, memories of small details from the life you shared as children. And because these subjects have been unearthed so often during the weeks you have spent together, you find yourself thinking about them even when you are alone. You don't want to think about them, but you do. You've spent the past 2 years consciously trying to avoid your parents, doing everything you can to keep them at arm's length. And you have gone back to Westfield, that's Westfield, New Jersey, gone back to Westfield only when you were certain that Gwyn was going to be there as well. You still love your parents, but you don't particularly like them anymore. You came to this conclusion after your sister went off to college, leaving you alone with them for your last 2 years of high school. And when you finally went off to college yourself, you felt as if you had broken out of prison. It's not that you pride yourself for feeling the way you do. In fact, you are revolted by it, appalled by your coldness and lack of compassion. And you constantly berate yourself for accepting money from your father, who supports you and pays your tuition. But you need to be in college in order to stay away from him and your mother. And since you have no money of your own, and since your father earns too much for you to qualify for a scholarship, what choice do you have but to wallow in the ignominy of your two-faced position? So you run. And as you run, you know you are running for your life. And unless you maintain the distance between you and your parents, you will begin to wither and die, just as surely as your brother Andy died when he drowned in Echo Lake on August 10th, 1957, that small lake in New Jersey with its eerily appropriate name, for Echo too withered and died. And after her beloved Narcissus drowned, there was nothing left of her but a heap of bones and the wailing of her disembodied, inextinguishable voice. You don't want to think about these things. You don't want to think about your parents and the 8 years you spent walled up in a house of grief. You were 10 at the time of Andy's death, and both you and Gwyn had been shipped off to a summer camp in New York State, which meant that neither one of you was present when the accident occurred. Your mother was alone with a 7-year-old Andy, planning to spend a week in the little lakeside bungalow your father bought in 1949 when you and your sister were no more than tots, the site of family summers, the site of smoky barbecues and mosquito-ridden sunsets. And the irony was that they were in the process of selling the place. This was to be the last summer at Echo Lake, just an hour's drive from home, but no longer the calm retreat it had been now that all the new houses were going up. And so, with her 2 oldest kids away, your mother succumbed to a burst of nostalgia and decided to haul Andy out to the lake, even though your father was too busy to go with them. Andy wasn't much of a swimmer at that point, was still struggling to get the hang of it. But he had a daredevil streak in him, and he incited mischief with such hell-bent exuberance that everyone thought he was destined to earn an advanced degree in practical jokes. On the 3rd day of the visit, sometime around 6 in the morning, with your mother still asleep in her room, Andy got it into his head to go for an unchaperoned swim. Before leaving, the 7-year-old adventurer sat down to write this short, semi-literate message. Dear, D-E-E-R-E, Mom, I'm, I-M-E, in the lake, love, L-O-V, Andy. Then tiptoed out of the bungalow, jumped into the water, and drowned. I'm in the lake. You don't want to think about it. You have run away now, and you don't have the heart to return to that house of screams and silences, to listen to your mother howling in the bedroom upstairs, to reopen the medicine cabinet and count the bottles of tranquilizers and antidepressants, to think about the doctors and the breakdowns and the suicide attempt and the long stay in the hospital when you were 12. You don't want to remember your father's eyes. Now, for years, they seemed to look right through you, nor his robotic daily drill of waking at 6 sharp every morning and not returning from work until 9 at night, or his refusal to mention the name of his dead son to you or your sister. You rarely saw him anymore, and with your mother all but incapable of tending the house and preparing meals, the ritual of the family dinner came to an end. The chores of cleaning and cooking were handled by a succession of so-called maids, principally worn-out black women in their 50s and 60s. And because on most nights your mother preferred to eat alone in her room, it was usually just you and your sister sitting face to face at the pink Formica table in the kitchen. Where your father ate his dinner was a mystery to you. You imagined that he went to restaurants, or perhaps the same restaurant every night, but he never said a word about it. It is painful for you to think about these things, but now that your sister is with you again, you can't help yourself. The memories come rushing in on you against your will, and when you sit down to work on the long poem you started in June, you often find yourself stopping in mid-phrase, staring out the window and reminiscing about your childhood. You realize now that you began running away from them much earlier than you suspected. If not for Andy's death, you probably would have remained a compliant, dutiful son until the hour you left home. But once the household began to fall apart, with your mother withdrawing into a state of permanent, guilt-racked mourning and your father scarcely present anymore, you had to look elsewhere for some kind of sustainable existence. In the circumscribed world of childhood, elsewhere meant school and the ball fields you played on with your friends. You wanted to excel at everything, and because you were lucky enough to have been endowed with reasonable intelligence and a strong body, your grades were always near the top of your class, and you stood out in any number of sports. You never sat down and thought any of this through. You were too young for that, but these successes helped to nullify some of the grimness that surrounded you at home, and the more you succeeded, the more you asserted your independence from your mother and father. They wished you well, of course. They were not actively against you. But a moment arrived, you could have been 11, when you began to crave the admiration of your friends as much as you craved your parents' love. Hours after your brother was carted off to the mental hospital, you swore an oath on your brother's memory to be a good person for the rest of your life. You were alone in the bathroom, you remember, alone in the bathroom, fighting back tears. And by good, you meant honest, kind, and generous. You meant never making fun of anyone, never feeling superior to anyone, and never picking a fight with anyone. You were 12 years old. When you were 13, you stopped believing in God. When you were 14, you spent the first of 3 consecutive summers working in your father's supermarket, bagging, shelving, manning the register, signing in deliveries, removing trash, thus perfecting the skills that would lead to your exalted position as a page at the Columbia Library. When you were 15, you fell in love with a girl named Patty French. Later that year, you told your sister that you were going to become a poet. When you were 16, Gwyn left home and you went into internal exile. Without Gwyn, you never would have made it that far. Much as you wanted to forge a life for yourself beyond the grasp of your family, home was where you lived. And without Gwyn to protect you in that home, you would have been smothered, annihilated, driven to the edge of madness. Early memories non-existent, but you first see her as a 5-year-old, as the two of you sit naked in the bathtub, your mother washing Gwyn's hair, the shampoo foaming up in frothy white spikes and bizarre undulations, as your sister throws back her head, laughing, and you look on in rapt wonder. Already, you loved her more than anyone else in the world, and until you were 6 or 7, you assumed that you would always live with her, that you would end up as man and wife. Needless to add that you sometimes squabbled and played nasty tricks on each other, but not habitually, not half as often as most siblings do. You look so much alike, with your dark hair and gray-green eyes, with your elongated bodies and smallish mouths, so alike that you could have passed for male and female versions of the same person. And then in jumped the fair-skinned Andy with his blonde curls and short, chubby frame, and right from the start you both found him a comical personage, a clever midget in soggy diapers who had joined the family for the sole purpose of entertaining you. For the first year of his life, you treated him like a toy or pet dog. But then he began to talk, and you reluctantly decided that he must be human. A real person then, but contrary to you and your sister, who tended to be restrained and well-mannered, your little brother was a dervish of fluctuating moods, alternately boisterous and sulky, prone to sudden, uncontrollable crying fits and long spurts of jungle-crazy laughter. It couldn't have been easy for him, trying to crack into the inner circle, trying to keep up with his big sister and brother. But the gap narrowed as he grew older, the frustrations gradually diminished, and near the end, the crybaby was developing into a good kid. More than a little daft at times. I'm in the lake, but nevertheless a good kid. Just before Andy was born, your parents moved you and your sister into adjoining bedrooms on the 3rd floor. It was a separate realm up there under the eaves, a small principality cut off from the rest of the house. And after the cataclysm of Echo Lake in August 1957, it became your refuge, the only spot in that fortress of sorrow where you and your sister could escape your grieving parents. You grieved too, of course, but you grieved in the way children do. More selfishly, perhaps more solemnly. And for many months, you and your sister tortured yourself by recounting all the less than kind things you had ever done to Andy. The taunts, the cutting remarks, the teasing insults, the slaps and shoves, the too hard punches, as if compelled by some shadowy sense of guilt to do penance, to grovel in your wickedness by endlessly rehearsing the slew of misdemeanors you had committed over the years. These recitations always took place at night, in the dark after you had gone to bed, the two of you talking through the open door between your rooms, or else one of you in the other's bed, lying side by side on your backs, looking up at the invisible ceiling. You felt like orphans then, with the ghosts of your parents haunting the floor below, and sleeping together became a natural reflex, an abiding comfort, a remedy to ward off the shakes and tears that came so often in the months after Andy's death. Intimacies of this sort were the unquestioned ground of your relations with your sister. It went all the way back to the beginning, to the very edge of conscious memory, and you cannot recall a single moment when you felt shy or afraid in her presence. You took baths with her when you were small children. You eagerly explored each other's bodies in games of doctor, and on stormy afternoons when you were confined to the house, Gwyn's preferred activity was jumping on the bed together, stark naked. Not just for the pleasure of the jumping, as she put it, but because she liked to see your penis flopping up and down. And diminutive as that organ must have been at that point in your life, you readily obliged her, since it always made her laugh. And nothing made you happier than to see your sister laugh. How old were you then? 4 years old? 5 years old? Eventually, children begin to recoil from the rowdy Caliban nudism of toddlerhood. By the time they reach the age of 6 or 7, the barriers of modesty have already gone up. For some reason, this failed to happen with you and Gwyn. No more splashing in the tub, perhaps, no more doctor games, no more jumping on the bed, but still, an altogether un-American casualness as far as your bodies were concerned. The door of the bathroom you shared was often left open. And how many times did you walk past that door and catch sight of Gwyn peeing into the toilet? How many times did she glimpse you stepping from the shower without a stitch of clothing on? It felt perfectly natural to see each other naked. And now, in the summer of 1967, as you put down your pen and look out the window to think about your childhood, you ponder this lack of inhibition and conclude that it must have been because you felt your body belonged to her, that each of you belonged to the other, and therefore it would have been unimaginable to act differently. It's true that as time went on, you both became somewhat more reserved. But even when your bodies began to change, you did not completely withdraw from each other. Remember the day Gwyn walked into your room, sat down on the bed, and lifted her blouse to show you the first tiny swell of her nipples, the earliest sign of her incipient growing breasts. Remember showing her your first pubic hair and one of your first adolescent erections. And you also remember standing next to her in the bathroom and looking at the blood run down her legs when she had her first period. Neither one of you thought twice about going to the other when these miracles occurred. Life-altering events demanded a witness, and what better person to serve that role than one of you? Then came the night of the grand experiment. Your parents were going away for the weekend, and they had decided that you and your sister were old enough to take care of yourselves without supervision. Gwyn was 15 and you were 14. She was nearly a woman, and you were just emerging from boyhood. But both of you were trapped in the throes of early teenage desperation, thinking about sex from morning to night, masturbating incessantly, out of your minds with desire, your bodies burning with lustful fantasies, longing to be touched by someone, to be kissed someone, ravenous and unfulfilled, aroused and alone, damned. The week before your parents' departure, the two of you had openly discussed the dilemma, the great contradiction of being old enough to want it, but too young to get it. The world had played a trick on you by forcing you to live in the mid-20th century, citizens of an advanced industrial nation, no less. Whereas if you had been born into a primitive tribe somewhere in the Amazon or the South Seas, you would no longer still be virgins. That was when you hatched your plan, immediately following that conversation, but you waited until your parents were gone before you put it into action. You were going to do it once, just once. It was supposed to be an experiment, not a new way of life. And no matter how much you enjoyed it, we'd have to stop after that one night, because if you went on with it after that, things would get out of hand. The two of you could easily get carried away, and then there would be the problem of having to account for bloody sheets, not to mention the grotesque possibility, the unthinkable possibility, which neither of you dared to talk about out loud. Anything and everything you decided, but no penetration, the whole gamut of opportunities and positions, as much as you both wanted, for as long as you both wanted it, but it would be a night of sex without intercourse. Since neither one of you had engaged in sex with anyone before, that prospect was exciting enough, and you spent the days leading up to your parents' departure in a delirium of anticipation, frightened to death, shocked by the boldness of the plan, crazed. It was the first chance you ever had to tell Gwyn how much you loved her, to tell her how beautiful you thought she was, to push your tongue inside her mouth and kiss her in the way you had dreamed of doing for months. You were trembling when you took off your clothes, trembling from head to toe when you crawled into the bed and felt her arms tighten around you. It was dark in the room, but you could dimly make out the gleam in your sister's eyes, the contours of her face, the outline of her body. And when you crawled under the covers and felt the nakedness of that body, the bare skin of your 15-year-old sister pressing against the bare skin of your own body, you shuddered, feeling almost breathless from the onrush of sensations coursing through you. You lay in each other's arms for several moments, legs entwined, cheeks touching, too awed to do anything but cling to each other and hope you wouldn't burst apart from sheer terror. Eventually, Gwyn began to run her hands along your back, and then she brought her mouth toward your face and kissed you hard, with an aggression you had not been expecting. And as her tongue shot into your mouth, you understood that there was no better thing in the world than being kissed in the way she was kissing you, that this was without argument the single most important justification for being alive. You went on kissing for a long spell, the two of you purring and pawing at each other as your tongues flailed and saliva slid down from your lips. At last, you screwed up your courage and placed your palms on her breasts, her small, still not fully grown breasts. For the first time in your life, you said to yourself, I am touching a girl's naked breasts. After you had run your hands over them for a while, you began to kiss the places you had touched, to flick your tongue around the nipples, to suck the nipples, and you were surprised when they grew firmer and more erect, as firm and erect as your penis had been since the moment you climbed on top of your naked sister. It was too much for you to handle. This initiation into the glories of female anatomy pushed you beyond your limits, and without any prompting from Gwyn, you suddenly had your first ejaculation of the night, a ferocious spasm that wound up all over her stomach. Mercifully, whatever embarrassment you felt was short-lived, for even as the juices were pouring out of you, Gwyn had begun to laugh, and by way of toasting your accomplishment, she merrily rubbed her hand across her belly. It went on for hours. You were both so young and inexperienced, both so charged up and indefatigable, both so crazy in your hunger for each other, and because you had promised that this would be the only time, neither one of you wanted it to end. So you kept at it. With the strength and stamina of your 14 years, you quickly rebounded from your accidental discharge, and as your sister gently put her hand around your rejuvenated penis, sublime transport, inexpressible joy, you forged on with your anatomy lesson by roaming your hands and mouth over other areas of her body. You discovered the delicious down-soft regions of nape and inner thigh, the indelible satisfactions of back hollow and buttocks, the almost unbearable delight of the licked ear, tactile bliss, but also the smell of the perfume Gwyn had put on for the occasion, the ever more sweaty slickness of your two bodies, and the little symphony of sounds you both made throughout the night, singly and together, the moans and whimpers, the sighs and yelps, and then, when Gwyn came for the first time, rubbing her clitoris with the middle finger of her left hand, the sound of air surging in and out of her nostrils, the accelerating speed of those breaths, the triumphant gasp at the end. The last time, followed by 2 more times, perhaps even a third. In your own case, beyond the early solo bungle, there was the hand of your sister wrapped around your penis, the hand moving up and down as you lay on your back in a fog of mounting excitation. And then there was her mouth also moving up and down, her mouth around your once again hard penis, and the profound intimacy you both felt when you came into that mouth, the fluid of one body passing into another, the intermingling of one person with another, conjoined spirits. Then your sister fell back onto the bed, opened her legs, and told you to touch her. Not there, she said, here. And she took your hand and guided you to the place where she wanted you to be, the place where you had never been, and you, who had known nothing before that night, slowly began your education as a human being. Thank you.
Really, I have to follow that? I had prepared remarks, but anyway. Anybody need a cigarette? Just please take your time. Yeah. So, I really do need a minute. Okay, so. All right, let's get serious. In light of Rick's remarks, it seems that I should also adapt mine because he spoke so eloquently of literary citizenship. And the first thing I'll say is that Paul Auster's reach extends well beyond Brooklyn, because when I was living in New Mexico in the mid-90s, Paul was trying to get me a job, and he's done this 3 or 4 times since then and has absolutely no recollection of it, any of them. And some of them are fairly recent, and I don't think that speaks to his state of mind, but rather the state of his generosity. There are many ways to be a literary citizen, and I think that Javier Marías, who I know as little as a man as Rick and the Brooklyn world knows Paul, is similarly, although very differently, a literary citizen, his equal. First of all, one thing that links Auster and Marías is they are both translators. Javier Marías has brought into Spanish an astounding array of literature, from Tristram Shandy to work by Nabokov and Updike and Salinger and Ashbery, and the list goes on. And if his work were limited only to translation of great work in English into Spanish, he would already have a reputation that would be important. In addition to those duties, Javier Marías, who was born in 1951 in Madrid, has been a publisher and a journalist. He has written a newspaper column for over 10 years, 15 years, that has millions of readers. And again, this would be enough of a contribution to the conversation that people have in the world of culture at large. But he's also found the time to publish over 30 books, and those books have been published in 40 languages around the world, and yet he remains not as well read in the United States as pretty much everywhere else in the world. His novel, the first novel I read of his, was called A Heart So White, and it has sold 1 million copies in Germany, and if you listen to its introductory 2 sentences, you might imagine both why it is so popular, and you might ask yourself why you may not have read it. I did not want to know, but I have since come to know, that one of the girls, when she wasn't a girl anymore and hadn't long been back from her honeymoon, went into the bathroom, stood in front of the mirror, unbuttoned her blouse, took off her bra, and aimed her father's gun at her heart. Her father at the time in the living room with other members of the family and 3 guests. When they heard the shot, some 5 minutes after the girl left the table, her father didn't get up right away, staying there for a few seconds, paralyzed, his mouth still full of food, not daring to chew or swallow, much less to spit the food out onto his plate. And when he finally did get up and run to the bathroom, those who followed him noticed that when he discovered the blood-splattered body of his daughter and clutched his head in his hands, he kept passing the mouthful of meat from one cheek to the other, still not knowing what to do with it. I defy any person who loves novels to encounter those 2 sentences and not want to continue to read. The patient syntax of Henry James is certainly present in them, but there's a kind of provocative question asking that a reader of Marías goes through, just basically wondering what is going to happen. And yet, there's a great deal more in Marías' novels than merely these provocations of plot. He cunningly uses plot as a means to license deeper reflections, and I think one of the things that Rick has said to his students is that before you can, in writing fiction, break their trust, break a reader's trust, you must earn it. And Marías manages to earn our trust by telling stories that we are dying to find out what happens next. It's the oldest and most basic thing. However, there's a deeper metaphysic at work. As he said of his writing, there's a tradition within novel form, almost forgotten now, which embodies what I call literary thinking. It is a way of thinking which takes place only in literature, the things you never think of or hit upon unless you are writing fiction or perhaps reading it. Unlike philosophical thinking, which demands an argument without logical flaws, literary thinking allows you to contradict yourself. Marías's fiction is full of contradictions, questions that get asked, resolved, and then asked again and resolved differently. His latest work, is a novel called Your Face Tomorrow, which has come out over the course of many years in 3 volumes, the third of which is out today. And it's his most extravagant showcase for literary thinking. It draws you in with plot, but it keeps you there with thought. And it serves as a compelling introduction to his writing. And despite its 1,500 pages, it's a great place to start. Javier Marías has not been here in 20 years, and so it's a great opportunity tonight to be able to hear his voice as he reads from Your Face Tomorrow. But I would also warn you that, as one of his narrators of another book has said, listening is the most dangerous thing of all. Listening means knowing, finding out, knowing everything there is to know. Ears don't have lids that can close against the words uttered. They can't hide from what they sense they're about to hear. It's always too late. Please welcome, just in time, Javier Marías.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm going to read 2 different excerpts from the 3rd volume of Your Face Tomorrow. Being a foreigner, I may mispronounce one word or other because what I'm going to read, I haven't written myself. The wording has been done by my wonderful translator, Margaret Jewel Costa, and therefore I'm not so familiar with this text as I would be with its equivalent in Spanish. Nostalgia, or missing some place or person, regardless of whether for reasons of absence or abandonment or death, is a very strange and contradictory business. At first, you think you can't live without someone or far from someone. The initial grief is so intense and so constant that you experience it as a kind of endless sinking or an interminably advancing spear, because each moment of privation counts and weighs. You feel it and it chokes you, and all you want is for the hours of the day to pass, knowing that their passing will lead to nothing new, only to more waiting for more waiting. Each morning you open your eyes, if you've had the benefit of sleep, which, while it doesn't allow you to forget everything, does at least numb and confuse, thinking the same thought that oppressed you just before you closed them. For example, she's not here and she won't be coming back, whether that means her coming back to you or back from death. And you prepare yourself not to trudge through the day because you are not even capable of looking that far ahead or of differentiating one day from another, but through the next 5 minutes and then the next. And so you'll continue from 5 minutes to 5 minutes, if not from minute to minute, becoming entangled in the more and at most trying to distract yourself for just 2 or 3 minutes from your consciousness or from your ponderous paralysis. If that happens, it has nothing to do with your will, but with some form of blessed chance, a curious item on the television news, the time it takes to complete or begin a crossword, an irritating or solicitous phone call from someone you can't stand, the bottle that falls to the floor and obliges you to gather up the fragments so that you don't cut yourself when out of laziness you wander about barefoot, or the dire TV series that nonetheless amuses you, or that you simply took to straight away, and to which you surrender yourself with inexplicable relief until the final credits roll, wishing another episode would start immediately and allow you to keep clinging on to that stupid thread of continuity. These are the found routines that sustain us, what remains of life, the foolish and the innocuous, that neither enthuses nor demands participation or effort, the padding that we despise when everything is fine and we're busy and have no time to miss anyone, not even the dead. In fact, we use those busy times to shrug them off, although this only works for a short while because the dead insist on staying dead and always come back later on, the pin-prick pressing into our chest and the lead upon our souls. Time passes, and at some ill-defined point we go back to being able to sleep without suddenly starting awake and without remembering what has happened in our dreams, and to shave in not at chance moments or at odd times, but each morning. No bottles are broken, and we remain unirritated by any phone call. We can make do without the TV soap opera, the crossword, the random soothing routines that we look at oddly as we bid farewell to them, because now we can scarcely understand why we ever needed them. And we can even make do without the patient people who entertained us and listened to us during our monotonous obsessive period of mourning. We raise our head and once more look around us, and although we see nothing particularly promising or attractive, nothing that can replace the person we long for and have lost, we begin to find it hard to sustain that longing and wonder if it was really such a loss. We are filled by a kind of retrospective laziness regarding the time when we loved or were devoted or got overexcited or anxious, and feeling capable of ever giving so much attention to anyone again, of trying to please them, of watching over their sleep and concealing from them what can be concealed or what might hurt them. And one finds enormous relief in that deep-rooted absence of alertness. I was abandoned, we think, by my lover, by my friend, by my dad, so what? They all left, and the result was the same. I just had to get on with my own life. They'll regret it in the end, because it's nice to know that one is loved, and sad to know one's been forgotten, and now I am forgetting them. And anyone who dies knows more or less what fate awaits him or her. I did what I could. I held firm, and still they drifted away. Then you quote these words to yourself: memory is a tremulous finger, and add in your own words, and it doesn't always succeed when it tries to point at us. We discover that our finger can no longer be trusted, or less and less often, and that those who absorbed our thoughts night and day and night and were fixed there like a nail hammered firmly in, gradually work loose and become of no importance to us. They grow blurred and, yes, tremulous, and one can even begin to doubt their existence as if they were a blood-stained, rubbed and scrubbed and cleaned, or of which only the rim remains, which is the part that takes longest to remove. And then that rim too finally submits. More time passes, and there comes a day just before the last trace vanishes, when the mere idea of seeing the lost person suddenly seems burdensome to us. Even though we may not be happy and may still miss them, even though their remoteness and loss still occasionally wounds us, one night, lying in bed, we look at our shoes alone by the leg of a chair, and we're filled with grief when we remember that her high heels once stood right next to them year after year, telling us that we were too even in sleep, even in absence. It turns out that the people we most loved and still love have become people from another era, or have been lost along our way, for we each have our own, have become almost preterite beings to whom we do not want to return because we know them too well, and the thread of continuity has been broken. We always view the past with a feeling of proud superiority, both it and its contents, even if our present is worse or less fortunate or sick, and the future promises no improvement of any kind. However brilliant and happy our past to us it seems contaminated with ingenuousness, ignorance, and in part, silliness. In the past, we never knew what would come after, and now we do. And in that sense, the past is inferior in objective, practical terms. That's why it always carries within it an element of hopeless foolishness and makes us feel ashamed that we lived for so long in a fantasy world, believing what we now know to be false, or perhaps it wasn't false then, but which has in a way ceased to be true by not resisting or persevering. The love, that seemed rock solid, the friendship we never doubted, the living person whom we always relied upon to live forever, because without him the world was inconceivable, or it was inconceivable that the world would still be the world and not some other place. We cannot help looking down slightly at our most beloved dead, the more so as more time passes and in passing wastes them, not just with sadness but with pity too, knowing as we do that they know nothing, how naive they were of what happened after their departure, whereas we do. We went to the funeral and listened to what was said there, as well as to what people muttered under their breath, as if afraid the departed might still be able to hear them, and we saw those who had harmed him boasting that they had been his closest friends and pretending to mourn him. He neither saw nor heard anything. He died deceived like everyone else, without ever knowing enough, and that's precisely what makes us pity them and consider them all to be poor men and poor women, poor grown-up children, poor devils. Those whom we left behind or who left our side know nothing about us either. As far as we are concerned, they've become as fixed and immovable as the dead, and the mere prospect of meeting again and having to talk to them and hear them seems to us like hard work, partly because we feel that neither they nor we would want to talk about or hear anything. I can't be bothered, we think. It's been far too long since she was a witness to my days. She used to know almost everything about me, or at least the most important things, and now a gap has opened up that could never be filled, even if I were to tell her in great detail all that has happened, everything of which she did not have immediate knowledge. I can't be bothered with having to get to know each other again and explain ourselves. How upsetting to recognize at once the old reactions and the old vices and the old anxieties and the old tones of voice in which I addressed her and she me, and even the same suppressed jealousies and the same passions, albeit unspoken now. I'll never be able to see her as someone new, nor as part of my daily existence. She'll seem simultaneously stale and alien. I'll go home to see Luisa and the children, and once I've spent a good long time with them and they're starting to get used to me, I'll sit down beside her for a rather shorter time, perhaps before going out to supper at a restaurant, while we wait for the babysitter who's late arriving, on the sofa we shared for so many years, but where I sit now like a visiting stranger, dependable or otherwise, and we won't know how to behave. There'll be pauses and clearings of the throat, and given that we're face to face, extraordinarily inane remarks such as, "So how are things with you?" or "You're looking really good." And then we'll realize that we can't be together without really being together, and that we don't want that. We will be neither completely natural nor completely artificial. It's not possible to be superficial with someone we've known deeply and since forever, nor deep with someone who has lost all track of us and covered her own tracks completely. For both of us, there is so much that is now unknown. And after half an hour, perhaps 1, 2 at the most, over dessert, we'll consider that there's nothing more to be said, and even stranger, that once is quite enough, and then I'll have 13 days holiday left to kill. And even if the unthinkable happened and we fell into each other's arms and she said the words I've been wanting to hear for so long now, "Come, come, I was so wrong about you before. Sit down here beside me again. I haven't yet shooed away your ghost. This pillow is still yours. I just couldn't see you clearly before. Come and embrace me, come to me, come back and stay here forever." Even if that happened and I gave up my London apartment and said farewell to Tupra and Perethnuix, to Mulryan and Rendell and even to Wheeler, and began the swift task of transforming them into a long parenthesis, and returned to Madrid to be with her, I would do so knowing that what has been interrupted cannot be resumed, that the gap would remain there always, hidden perhaps, but constant, and knowing that a before and an after can never be knit together. Now the second excerpt perhaps needs a little explanation about the context. It belongs to a very long scene in the third volume of Your Face Tomorrow, in which the narrator's boss, whose name is Tupra or Reresby, he uses, or Dundas as well, he uses different names, has taken the narrator to his place and one night and has decided that he's going to show him a series of videos of rather embarrassing acts or even crimes committed by people of some importance, or the people of some importance being the victims to those crimes, and the narrator says, "Nor had I ever seen or even conceived of an arranged bestial rape with spectators as if they were at a tryout for young fighting bulls, a small arena, or perhaps the central courtyard of a group of houses, well-dressed men sitting beneath white, red, and green awnings, a vicious sun, thick mustaches, and Texan hats, and not a few Havana cigars clenched between teeth. There was the festive sound of a brass band in the background, encouraging shouts in Spanish and in English, and in the arena, a woman, a horse, a few mamporreros, men employed to help stallions mate with mares, and something tearing. I couldn't bear it. I closed my eyes. Don't close your eyes. And so I looked away. Don't look away. But I did, except for the odd moment. This I really couldn't stand because I couldn't believe it. I'd never imagined such a thing were possible in the world, purely as a form of entertainment, and it really was a mortal poison. The images, what I glimpsed of them, for my eyelids and my turned-away face were quick to save me, entered my mind as if they were an ugly reptile or a kind of serpent, or perhaps an eel, or leeches under the skin. How can I put it? Internal leeches. The images slipped inside me like a foreign body that caused me immediate pain and a sense of oppression and suffocation, and the urgent need for someone to remove it. Let me sit heavy on thy soul. But you cannot root out what enters through the eyes, nor what enters through the ears. It installs itself inside you, and there's nothing to be done about it. Or else you have to wait some time in order to be able to persuade yourself that you did not see or hear what you did see or hear. There's always a doubt, or the trace of a doubt, that it was imagination or a misunderstanding, or a mirage or a hallucination or a malicious misinterpretation. We are none of us immune from them when our thoughts and our perceptions become twisted and we judge everything in the same slanted, sinister light. This is Ciudad Juárez in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico, murmured Tupra in his ever more sunken voice and in a tone that wasn't in the least indifferent, but almost sorrowful, grave, and it didn't sound to me as if he were putting it on. And there you have one of the 1,000 women who have disappeared and about whom so much has been written in the press. That, however, is not what matters to us, important though it is, but rather that man there, to the right in the second row, the one all in white and wearing a red tie. This forced me to look for a moment reluctantly and out of the corner of my eye. How hard it is to resist curiosity when someone points a finger at something. I saw a man in the audience, a fat, smiling, middle-aged man with shiny skin and thick hair, though I couldn't help but see as well the terrible irrationality and more tearing in some blood now, like a sword or a spear, and I turned away again towards where Reresby was sitting, his eyes fixed on the screen, but screwed up now, as if he needed glasses or were preparing to close them at any moment, Perhaps that episode, even though he had seen it before and knew how it would end, really set his teeth on edge or provoked anguish or even repugnance. Bloody and guilty, guiltily awake. No one can bear everything, and as I said, he was not a sadist. At the time, and this is a few years ago now, he was a very rich businessman, not yet a tycoon. Now he is, though, and he's standing for the post of mayor in an important town, in another region, in another state on the border with the United States, Coahuila. And he'll get it too. It will be useful for us to have this film of him enjoying the show. He mispronounced Coahuila, saying it as if it were an English word. It's less well known than Chihuahua. Something like Coahuila. The worst thing was that the event seemed not to be a single episode. I certainly didn't get the impression that everything had been arranged for this one occasion. The band, the awnings, the horse and its experienced handlers, the invitation doubtless made over the internet and in code or through messages left on cell phones, doubtless in a whisper. What I glimpsed had probably happened before, perhaps with minor variations, with a different animal perhaps, but I didn't want to go down that road, and I tore out all further imaginings by the roots. It's pronounced Coahuila, I said, unable to resist the desire to correct him. A further example of that mysterious impulse to impose good order and unnecessary precision at all costs. I said this while looking at him, but he wasn't looking at me. He still kept his eyes glued to the screen for a few more seconds, almost half closed now, his expression one of scorn and disgust for what he was seeing. His wasn't the face of a man unmoved by cruelty and by the suffering of others. He was judging them severely. Then he fast-forwarded again, and after a while froze the image. It's all right, you can look now. I've stopped at another scene, the next one. But Jack, he added with barely suppressed irritation, yet almost kindly, I'm not showing you all this in order for you not to look at it. Quite the opposite. Otherwise, what's the point? I don't want to see any more, Bertie, I said. If it's all like that, I don't want to see anything. I think I understand where you're going with this, and I don't need to know any more. Besides, why don't you use these images to do something about it? You could use them to find out, through that fat man you appear to know so well and who's been so very successful, just what's going on in that place and to stop it. I don't understand your passivity, the organization's passivity. Do you really think that the Mexicans and the Americans don't already have a copy of this tape? If they don't intervene in the matter, there's not much we can do at our end, and it's not always easy to take action. In some countries, such a video would be unacceptable as proof. The way it was obtained would invalidate it. And what would we accuse our fat friend of? Attending an illegal event? Doing nothing? Refusing to help? Bah, I can't understand why they might simply keep it filed away for a better occasion, just in case. I can't criticize them for that. We do the same with most of the footage that concerns us and our territories. You might save more lives by forcing one individual to do something later on than by immediately coming down hard on the less important people. And we're always interested in saving lives. We're always making calculations, weighing up whether it's worth letting one person die now, if that will mean many others will live. Our priority, understandably enough, is saving British lives, as it would be in time of war. We have to get the most benefit out of everything, even if that means waiting a few years. It's the same with the day-to-day work in the office. Sometimes you have to wait until someone is in a position to carry out what we have predicted that he or she is capable of doing, including the things you predict, Jack, the things you tell us about. Everything you tell me counts. Nothing is wasted. And it's the same with this. He did finally look at me as he spoke these last few sentences. His eyes, gray in the gloom, no longer half closed. He's now wide open, absorbent eyes that made anyone who they alighted on feel worthy of attention and of interpretation. And it seemed to me that his words had been intended to increase that feeling in me. I had still not yet turned back to the screen again, despite his reassuring words. Go on, look. You must see at least one more recording. I'll fast forward more quickly. I'll jump over a few, since you find them so upsetting. Here he did not spare me his sarcasm. I didn't care. I held up my hand to indicate that it was not yet the moment, that there was something I wanted to clear up first. Perhaps I needed a minute to recover from what I had seen, and another to get myself used to the idea that there were doubtless still more unpleasant things to see, more poison. However, I disguised this by asking as if my curiosity needed to be urgently assuaged. Where do you get them from? How do you find them? The things you've shown me up until now, I mean. None of them is a situation where cameras would be permitted. From anywhere, from all kinds of places, and in all kinds of ways. The opportunities are endless nowadays. On the one hand, we have our own traditional means, our installers and our infiltrators, and other people we bribe to do the filming. But people sell images too. There's a whole floating market out there, and we just buy whatever might be of interest to us. We get them cheap when the seller doesn't know the identity of the people who appear in them. We usually do know, or we can find out, whether they are mere minions or obscure hired assassins or people of a certain importance. It's the same as in the art market. If the buyer knows the true value and the seller doesn't, then the result is a bargain. How every fool owns and carries a mini camera in his pocket or has one on his cell phone, and if a tourist chances to capture some serious incident, even a crime, he's more likely to try and make some money out of it than take it to the police. The police don't pay, but we do, as do others, through intermediaries. It's the same if they catch some celebrity naked or screwing someone. They'll put it up for sale to the sensationalist magazines and TV shows. It's good to have someone keeping an eye on such things. At other times, our colleagues in other countries send us videos, and we reciprocate with anything that might be of use to them. Satellites pick up a lot too. Nowadays, it's the easiest thing in the world. There are recordings of everything. People no longer have any idea where cameras might be hidden, or still don't believe that there are quite that many. The most sensible thing is to assume that they are everywhere, all the time, even in hotel rooms and in brothels and in saunas and in public toilets, not in the handicapped toilets, though. They don't tend to put them there. And even in private houses. No one is safe anymore from being filmed doing anything and in any circumstances, whether committing a crime or indulging in depraved sexual acts, always good possibilities. We aren't always so lucky, of course, and what we get hold of and watch is a tiny fraction of what's available. We can make immediate use, I mean legal use, of very little. But our archive is pretty good for future or hypothetical use, with a view to reaching private agreements. People really care about their image and can always be persuaded to withdraw or to make some kind of pact. You'd be surprised how much they care, even the non-famous, even businessmen who are unknown to most people, I mean to those who watch television or read newspapers, because they know they would immediately cease to be unknown. It's very widespread, that panic of yours, that narrative panic of horror, as you called it. Everyone is convinced that they could have a story or could provide the material for a story. They just need someone to tell it, to decide to tell it. And there's nothing easier than rescuing someone from anonymity. Many people struggle and do their utmost to drag themselves out of anonymity. You know the kind of thing. They offer up their daily life on the internet 24 hours a day. They plan scandals or notorious frauds. They try to launch themselves into celebrity, even of the ugliest kind. They invent some ridiculous piece of tittle-tattle in order to be invited to talk about it, and the most obscure and poetry of programs in the small hours. They seek out the indirect contagion of someone else's fame, however vile, or they pick up a fight in the TV studio and trade insults and try to have stupid, inane photos taken of themselves with an actor, a soccer star, a singer, a millionaire, a politician, a member of the royal family, a model. They live a murder, an acquaintance, or a stranger in the most gruesome, complicated way, in a particularly cruel or striking or spine-chilling fashion. A child killing a much younger child, an adolescent killing his parents, a young woman killing a wicked colleague, an adult staging a massacre in a public place, or secretly doing in 7 people, one after the other, hoping to be discovered at last and to amaze the world. Because anyone, even the most stupid person, can kill someone. And they don't know that all they have to do is carry on with their lives until someone finds them interesting and adopts the appropriate point of view and decides to tell the story, or at least takes an interest and pays them some attention. As long as there is in that life some shameful, untold episode, a stain, or an anomaly. And that's not so very difficult, Jack, because we all have something of the sort in our past, possibly without even knowing that we do, or without being able to put our finger on it. It depends on who's looking at us. And the worst that can happen to anyone is for no one to look at them. People can't bear it and go into a decline. Some people die of it or kill. And he paused long enough for me to think, Tupra has adopted my theory or snippets of it. He has the delicacy not to use my exact words, or when he does, to acknowledge that he has done so, as you called it, or to use your term. He says, when he's quoting me verbatim, he has the good taste not to appropriate, at least not in my presence, the idea that people hate being left out or passed over, and prefer always to be seen and judged for good or ill, or even for worse, and even need this and yearn for it, the idea that they still cannot do without the supposed eye of God that observed and watched us for centuries, without that companionable belief that some being is aware of us at all times and knows everything about us and follows every detail of our trajectory, like someone following a story of which we are the protagonist. What they can't bear and won't allow is to remain unobserved by anyone, to be neither approved nor disapproved of, neither rewarded nor punished nor threatened, to be unable to count on any spectator or witness, regardless of whether they are for us or against us. And they seek out or invent substitutes for that eye, which is now closed or wounded or weary or inert or bored or blind, or which has simply looked away from what I am doing. Perhaps that's why people today care so little about being spied on and filmed, and often even provoke it through exhibitionism, although that can prove detrimental and draw down upon them precisely the thing they most dread, the conversion of the story into a disaster. It's a contradictory double need. I want it to be known that I exist and have existed, and I want my deeds to be known. But that frightens me too, because it might ruin forever the picture I'm painting of myself. And so when I'm not there, Tupra will probably have no qualms about appropriating wholesale everything I said to him when I talked about Degdelov, or indeed on other occasions, and he'll think he thought of it himself. In that regard, he'll be like any other boss. Perhaps Perethnwix was right, and I do have more influence over him than I think. Perhaps I do stimulate and amuse him. Maybe that's why he has a soft spot for me and invites or drags me to his house and shows me this collection of horrible videos, and is so patient with me and lets me get away with so many things, even letting me cover my eyes and not look at what he's generous enough to show me in an act of great trust, or to watch it with only one eye open. Thank you.
Good work. How can you do this in English? I mean, it's an
Well,
unbelievably
not so
very
well.
done. No, it's very good. Extremely good.
Thank you.
Extremely good.
Thank you both. There's just a few questions, and most of them are for both of you. Paul, maybe you'll take this one first. How does a writer approach the composition of such difficult material as sexual transgression or cruelty in the form of physical violence? When a writer takes a reader to a dangerous place, to what extent has the writer traveled to that place as well?
Well, you're asking the biggest question that can be asked. As a novelist, as a storyteller, you are projecting yourself into situations. You are entering the minds and bodies of imaginary people who are not you, and yet, needless to say, are a product of your imagination, which means to say a product of your inner being. And it's very tough. It's very tough. You go into dangerous territory, you're feeling you're taking risks, and you're falling off the edge of a cliff all the time. So it's the challenge of writing, because all of this is about being human. But you know, a lot about being human is very difficult to bear. And I think it's the writer's job to face it, and it's not easy.
Javier, the same question.
Oh, the same. Well, certainly, when you write difficult things or cruel things, or I don't know, some writers do in fact, I think, wallow in those things. I don't. I try to make things. I try that things make an impression on the reader, but with legitimate means, we could say. Not. I mean, if you describe something terrible, you have that in the newspapers every day. The mere description of something extremely cruel, extremely terrible, makes an impression. That's easy. That's very easy. At the same time, what does interest me when I approach that kind of material is that the cruelty or the violence, even if it's not very much described, as in what I read in the second excerpt, it's just tiny, a very tiny thing, but you can understand what's going on with just 3 words or 4. And of course, as the narrator does, I close my eyes. I don't look at it. I prefer not to look at that, just to suggest it, and because I think that the other way is rather cheap. But certainly, as Paul Auster said, you are very often on the verge of a cliff with that kind of tough material, or even with sex, which can be tough sometimes.
Another question for both of you, and Javier, maybe you could go first. How did an early career as a translator help to prepare you for your work as a storyteller?
Oh, very much. In fact, whenever I have been asked by someone or in an interview or something, what do I think about creative writing and all those things, I always say that if I ever had a creative writing school, whatever you call them, God forbid, I would only accept students who would know at least one language besides their own. And the only thing I would make them do is to translate and to translate and to translate, because I think that's the best possible school for someone who wants to become a writer. Of course, Paul Auster could say many things about that, since he's been for a long time a translator from the French. But I shall just mention 2 things which are very important. If you if you come, some people have said always that a translator is a very privileged reader because he reads so carefully. But he's also a very privileged writer, of course, when he translates something good. And he has to rewrite a text. And if you rewrite Conrad or Lawrence Stern or Nabokov or Faulkner or Sir Thomas Browne, as I did in the past, and you do it acceptably, you have done a lot. You have done quite a lot. And your tool or your instrument has been tuned, as it were. Of course, translation doesn't give you talent, doesn't give you imagination, doesn't give you invention, but it tunes your instrument and it polishes the tool of the language you're going to use in your career. And the second important thing is that if you happen to have a style of your own, one of the main things you have to do when you do translate is to get rid of it, to renounce that style, and act like an actor and say, well, now I'm going to write like Conrad or like Wallace Stevens or like, which is a very difficult thing to do. But that's a marvelous exercise as well.
Well, I agree. I never took any writing classes myself, and I think my education as a writer was formed by translation. Pounds always advised young poets to translate. I taught for a while at Princeton in the mid to late 80s for about 5 years, and I taught a translation class, which was much better than teaching creative writing, I have to say. And I only allowed the students to do poetry, and I made them pick one poet that I had to approve of and work on that poet for the entire semester. So I had people working on Hölderlin, Leopardi, Homer, all the great poets of the Western tradition. It was a fabulous experience for me and for the students, some of whom became professional translators afterwards. They were so excited about it. I think for a young writer, you're so unsure of yourself. You don't really know what you're going to do. You don't know how to do it yet. You take a great text, and then you have to enter it. You have to get into the bloodstream, into the bones, the tissue, and pull it apart and put it back together again. And I think actually talent can really help a lot. A brilliant young translator can bring a lot to a text that a dull translator can't. And so a lot of literary ability is needed, but all the pressure's off. You don't have to be inventing. You have to be responding to and recreating, and I think it's a marvelous thing for young people to do.
If I may add something which is important for me, for my own writing, which is I think that I did that translation I did in the 1970s and 80s mainly. After that, I haven't done it so much. And I think that the way I do write, or I've been writing for the last 20 or 25 years, has something to do with it. I mean, the moment I have a draft, a first draft of something, I consider that to be the original, which helps a lot. And then I work from that draft, considering, well, this is the original as when I did translate.
Another one for both of you, and Paul, maybe you could go first. Your admiration for certain writers is well known. Beckett, Hawthorne, Poe, Shakespeare, Faulkner, among many others. But are there great writers which you avoid? And there's a second question here. Are there writers you are intimidated by?
Avoiding. It's interesting. As I'm sure most of you know, I'm married to a writer, Siri Hustvedt, an extraordinarily brilliant writer who is much more erudite than I am and knows a lot more about just about everything than I do. Siri is a great, great fan of George Eliot, Middlemarch in particular, but all of the novels. And her prompting has led me to try to read Middlemarch about 4 times during our 30-year marriage, and I've never gotten past page 50. Henry James, the other hero of series World, is someone that I've always had a lot of difficulty with. A number of years ago, I made the promise that I would sit down and read some James one summer, and I couldn't really tackle any of the novels, but I took on some of the novellas, and I liked it very much. There's some of them that I felt very, very inspired by and close to. So yeah, there are writers I can't get my mouth around. I can't get my brain around. And what was the other question?
Any who intimidate you?
Who intimidates me? Nobody, really. No, nobody intimidates me. Yeah.
Yes, well, I would put it in a different way, perhaps. Of course, you always answer to the last part of a question instead of to the first one. And I think some writers, that depends, of course, on each writer. But to me, some writers are very fertile and some writers are not. By this I mean that I think that some of them cannot be followed at all. They are a world in themselves. Their imitators or their followers are usually terrible, in my opinion, whereas others open up fields and byways and that you can explore. And for me, for instance, Shakespeare, I mean, who would be more intimidating than Shakespeare? But to me, he's one of those fertile authors. He's still so mysterious. He suggested so many things he didn't quite explore. You see so many byways he didn't get into that it stimulates me to go those ways. Whereas others, like Kafka, for instance, who is a god for so many writers, I find them very admirable, certainly, but I think that you cannot follow them, and I think that Kafkaesque, all the Kafkaesque prose that has been written after Kafka, which is a lot, it's really terrible. So let's put it this way.
Well, I just want to I want to support what you're saying. Kafka is a unique writer, and there is no second generation Kafka. I mean, it's impossible.
Well, they tried it.
Yeah, but it doesn't work. I agree. And the thing about Kafka is he defies exegesis. You cannot really analyze Kafka. He resists every kind of literary criticism, which makes him very special in writing. But talking about Shakespeare, I mean, I think about him every day. And Shakespeare gives me the strength and the courage to take risks, because I think there's no writer who has tried to encompass more of humanity and more ways of approaching writing than Shakespeare did. After all, he wrote tragedies and comedies and romances. He did everything. And I think that example is very inspiring. And I can't think of anybody after Shakespeare who so invigorates me and gives me the courage to go on and follow all the little paths I want to take, because somebody did it before me, and it helps.
If I may add something to that, it's not only what Paul Auster said about Shakespeare, of course, but it's also that, as I said, he's very mysterious. For instance, I'm sure that you all know here the beginning of the famous Othello's monologue, and I realized that when I had to translate it, not for publication, but just for myself, and it begins with, "It is the cause my soul." And all of a sudden, you say, well, what does, I mean, we read that, we listen to that, and we seem to understand it very easily, and that's it. But in reality, what does that mean? Because he doesn't say this is the cause. You know, when I had to translate it, I said, well, it's not this is the cause. It's not, of course, she is the cause. What he says is it is the cause. I don't know what that means, do you? And if you come to very famous fragments by him, and you stop and wait a minute, you find out so many times that he's terribly mysterious, and that you can go on and on with him.
One final question for both of you, and Javier, you could go first. What is the appeal of casting detectives, spies, ghosts, or even fellow writers as your narrators?
Excuse me, what is the what?
What is the
the
appeal
appeal.
of casting them as your narrators? Detectives, spies, ghosts, or fellow writers as your narrators?
Of what? The appeal of what?
The appeal of casting them.
Casting.
Choosing narrators.
Oh, casting in the sense of, I see, I'm sorry. I didn't quite understand. Well, of course, those are very different professions, but I prefer the one of ghost. And I think that a ghost is an extremely, I wrote once a story which is narrated by a ghost. Of course, many people did that. And, but I realized that the point of view of a ghost is a marvelous point of view to tell a story, because you can tell a story the way probably most stories should be told. That is, a ghost is someone to whom nothing can happen anymore. Everything that could happen to him has already happened. He's out, as it were. But at the same time, he or she, of course, is someone who is not at all indifferent to things or to the world he left behind. On the contrary, if they do haunt castles and people and enemies and friends, it's because they still care a lot about what they left behind, so they still care a lot about the story they could tell. At the same time, they are out of it. And I think that's probably the best possible way for a novelist to tell a story, to mind about what you're telling and to be out of it and not be able to be impressed by what you're telling. And a spy is somehow similar to a ghost. And what?
Oh, you don't have to answer them all
Okay.
if you don't want.
I agree with everything our eminent Spanish friend has said, and thank you all so much for coming.